Hello, I'm Julia Walsh from Brand Medicine International. I started out my career as a research scientist, which is why I'm really interested in the clinical side of what I do, which is actually the communication strategy for pharmaceutical products. Looking at the clinical side, I can really see a lot of opportunity for my work in search listening. And I'm a search listening specialist. I have pretty much developed an application for this discipline for the healthcare sector over the last 12 months or so. And so in today's discussion, as part of Reuters Clinical 2021, I wanted to really examine the potential for search listening to leverage and manage the online narrative before, during, and after a clinical trial. So let's dive into a bit of an overview of what search listening is and how it could be relevant in this context. And I'm hoping that by reviewing this, you will probably get a whole lot of ideas as well from your perspective as a clinical trial investigator, or whatever your role is in terms of clinical trial development and implementation. So why is search listening potentially a really useful tool? Well, it's because of the scale of the data. The fact that people turn to search engines all the time, with about 1 billion queries entered into search engines related to health every single day. So this provides us an enormous data set that we can tap into to understand the real world questions that patients are asking. And we can also discern from the types of questions asked where healthcare professionals are asking questions as well. People turn to search engines to ask queries from right when they have that first symptom to when they receive a diagnosis. 80% of the people in a survey we undertook at Brand Medicine also confirmed that when they get a prescription medication, they turn to search engines to look up information about it. And so while there might be regulatory restrictions around what we can post online as an industry, the reality is that people are turning to search engines for information about prescription products. And they're also looking up information about products that are in the trial process, so not yet launched. And I feel that as an industry, we really have a responsibility to acknowledge that this dialogue is happening, this interaction with search engines is happening, whether we like it or not. So I think it's a really important thing to examine and understand how this behavior and the results that people find can influence the narrative around an emerging therapy. We can also use it as well to potentially identify patients to recruit them into trials. So an important part of my work in search listening is not just looking at the questions that people are asking, but actually following through those queries to see what kind of results are being served back to them. So this would be the search engine results pages. And as you know, a lot of people really don't go very far past page 1. The patient information experience is the term that I use to encapsulate this whole journey online. And essentially what happens with search listening is that we're identifying the questions that people are asking. It's kind of like a digital truth serum. They turn to search engines to ask the questions that they might even be embarrassed to bring up with their healthcare professional or with trial investigators, or anyone else for that matter. So what they find in response to these queries is something that can then be dragged in to patient groups online as well. And that's why it's really important that we understand the search information dynamics, because this can be amplified once the content that people find through that search experience is dragged into those patient groups and discussed in those forums. And it can really lead to an explosion of misinformation across a category. We also know that online behavior influences offline behavior. So information that people find online can actually cause speed bumps in the process that that patient will have in terms of that consultative experience with their healthcare professional, because they will have created assumptions around something based on what they found online that could be based on non-evidence-based content. And then the healthcare professionals put in a situation where they have to undo all of these assumptions, and it can be very time consuming for them. So essentially what I do when I look at the search results is I'm following these patients down the rabbit hole, And it's really important to consider what that rabbit hole might look like for a trial product, a trial drug that is not yet in the public domain in any formal sense. Because whether we like it or not, people are still turning to search engines to ask questions about it. And necessarily, these search engines return results to those questions, and they might be far from perfect. I even see this in terms of very frequently asked questions around approved medications, where very high profile results coming up on page 1 on Google can actually be published content by non-healthcare professionals, content that has not been reviewed by the sponsor of the medication. And it's really important to kind of know that this content is there and make sure that as the sponsor, you're comfortable to know that thousands of patients in your category are potentially viewing this, and is it definitely giving them the right advice? It is really important to know where these patients are going down the rabbit hole. One of the other things I do is I overlay the stages of grief that a patient goes through and experiences as they grapple with a serious diagnosis. When they reach that point of acceptance, they often start referring to their disease in a different way through the way they search for it. So they might say, my diabetes or my high blood pressure. In this case, when someone's looking up information about my cancer, what's happening is that they've been brought to a blog, My Cancer Story Rocks. And this is an auto-suggest being served up to them by Google. And the reason why this is attractive to someone who has cancer and might have been intending to ask about my cancer is in remission or my cancer has metastasized is because it's offering them hope by this title, My Cancer Story Rocks. Who doesn't want to know about that? And this man is actually talking about a dog medication, and he's showing links on how to buy it on Amazon, which is shocking. And he also talks about the fact that it's also very commonly out of stock. And so he's directing them to generic alternatives. And this is what's happening online, whether we as an industry want to know that or not. So potentially, if you want to recruit people with cancer into clinical trials, knowing that this is one of the rabbit holes they've been directed down to, you could request Google to deprioritize that search result. And you could also create content that will turn up when patients are redirected to that landing page. So this is where the search results get measured as part of the process that I undertake with search listening. I give it a score out of 6 in terms of, are those search results, are they locally relevant? Are they intuitive for a patient to understand? Because of course, when a patient is looking up something that's in very early stages of scientific discovery, all of the content they're going to get is very technical and it's not going to be intuitive for them. So it invites people with different levels of health literacy to interpret that content differently. And that can be an issue. So we want evidence-based, patient-friendly content to be searchable for these people, and making sure that it's true, and making sure that we turn up with empathy when people are searching around conditions that they have huge emotional concerns over. And it's really important that we displace the outdated content with new content for these patients in their patient information experience journey. So today's discussion, I really wanted to activate search listening as a tool to look at how it can be used for clinical trial recruitment. For example, patients, when they're in that stage of bargaining, which is one of the processes in the stages of grief, and if they've got a diagnosis of diabetes, a bargaining question they might be asking could be, can newly diagnosed diabetes be reversed? In fact, this is a very commonly asked question. I believe this represents a wonderful opportunity to reach potential participants. We can also see questions being entered into search engines where people are actually actively seeking type 2 diabetes trial USA, things like that. So these are also wonderful opportunities to turn up in response to these search queries and invite participants to apply for participation in your trial. The reason why I think this is really important to understand in terms of the opportunity that search listening offers is because I can see at the moment there's 816 studies in diabetes that are either currently recruiting or not yet recruiting. However, that very commonly asked question in the diabetes category around can newly diagnosed diabetes be reversed doesn't invite any applications for those clinical trials in the search results. In fact, it's even blank here. Now, this space here is where a Google ad would be positioned if someone had purchased that ad to correlate with this question, but nobody has. So just as an example, you could position an ad here, and this is something hokey that I've just mocked up. But we are recruiting for a diabetes trial. Are you interested? Learn more. And you can funnel that prospect through here and get them to undertake a preliminary application to see if they are suitable for participation in your trial. So when we consider that there's 816 trials currently recruiting, but there's nothing in response to this very commonly asked question in the Google search results that could correlate and funnel those patients through, that's where I believe search listening offers a really huge opportunity. The other thing that's really important to consider is the opportunity that search listening offers as a tool to furnish enrolled participants with information. So what I can see from some of the molecules that are actually in studies at the moment is that there are active questions being asked into search engines right now today about those molecules. So it's important as a sponsor to consider what are the results that are coming up in response to these commonly asked questions around your molecule. So for example, this question here, is the sponsor intercepting and redirecting these queries to trial coordinators? If there are thousands of people enrolled in a trial and maybe a few hundred of them, because of that amplification effect that can happen where people drag information they find online into patient groups, it's really important to intercept these searches early and redirect them back. Oh, I see you're asking about this. Get in contact with our investigators here. And this question here as well indicates to me by the way that it's been asked that this is perhaps a healthcare professional or an investigator or someone involved in the trial asking about the drug because they're looking for the mechanism of action. So again, you could design your content to turn up in response to that in an appropriate way. So this is the real world search result in the US to this real world question. So I know that we're talking about actual drugs here, and the thing is that I feel it's really important to get this out in the open because this is all out there in the public domain anyway. So we have a responsibility as an industry, I believe, to be seeing these dynamics that are happening online and to acknowledge them and to design a response to them. So for example, in this one, you could obviously you can't publish necessarily anything online about it, but if this is a person who's in a trial and they're turning to search engines, you could actually ask them to enter, you can segment that query based on who it might be and funnel it back to the people who are responsible, medical information or whoever is responsible for disseminating information about that. And it just distracts your searcher away from potential misinformation that you don't have control over. And that's why I feel like it's a really great tool. So the other thing to think about is how can search listening act as a tool to manage the online narrative? People will turn to search engines when they hear information of influencers in social media groups. It could be through a publicity or a press release that's been released to news organizations, and now they want to know more about that trial. So understanding the way that the questions are asked in their real words is very important, because by doing that through search listening, you're able to then follow that query through and see where they're ending up. It's important not to allow the narrative around an emerging treatment be entirely managed by news outlets. So it's very important that we follow those queries through. and that we take into account that this can happen. I did also want to illustrate, because of course, right now, the vaccine trials are the biggest thing that globally everybody has an enormous amount of invested interest in, because on a personal level, there's not a human on the planet who is not interested in the vaccine rollout. And so while this example is exaggerated because of the heightened interest and responsiveness to this particular category at this point in history, this can be replicated in any category through any trial, depending on the connectivity of the patients in the patient groups and the profile of the discussion that is initiated. So I don't know if you've already guessed potentially what I could be talking about right here, but about a month ago, Gert van Bosch came out, and he is a vaccine researcher with a pretty interesting CV in this area. And he made some statements that really ignited the public debate. And what I saw through search listening is that people immediately turned to search engines to ask questions. I saw almost 400 questions in relation to this particular gentleman and the information that he had brought to light, and his opinion on and perspective on this particular issue of the vaccines. So you can see here that, you know, he was not even, for the whole year that nobody ever asked any questions about him, he came out with that statement, and there was an explosion in the number of questions. And then these are just some examples of the queries that were entered into search engines. One of the common queries, of course, was who Gert van Bosch? Excuse the non-full sentence, but this is sometimes how people search. And this is the actual page that comes up in the US in response to this question that people are commonly asking in response to that information. So I think it's just a good example of how, when this happens, it's important from a risk management point of view, and to own the public narrative in response to a situation, to be prepared for these kind of things. And through search listening, you can actually get alerts as well that can give you an early indication. So you can find when one or two people start asking that question, you know that potentially this is indicative of a trend of questions to be asked about this particular topic, and you can prepare to respond to that. And I think that that's a really important way of managing risk. So the questions that I created for this that I'd like to explore as part of the clinical trial environment is, how can search data identify and connect with potential clinical trial participants? I think we saw there earlier how you can identify people when they're asking about particular symptoms. You can identify people who are in that denial or bargaining stage of receiving a diagnosis, and you can connect with them there. You can also find people through search listening that are actively looking to participate in clinical trials. The other thing that's important is that when you consider 70,000 questions are entered into search engines about health as a topic every single minute of the day globally, that means that rare patients are going to turn up. So we can actually read and get signals on the kind of questions that patients with rare diseases are actually asking, and we can see how they verbalize questions around symptoms, and we can see whether or not there's opportunities to turn up in those response pages and recruit them into the trials that we're looking for those patients for. It's not so hard to find a unicorn, as it turns out. And I believe that this does really represent a new opportunity for clinical trial recruitment. It's important to consider when you're preparing for a trial what could be potential triggers of search. If you're tracking that molecule throughout a trial, people can be asking search engines for association with particular side effects. So before they've even reported them to the trial sites, they might be speculating in the middle of the night, potentially, does this cause that? And you will see those questions come up, and it can provide you an early signal of potential emerging adverse reactions. And I think that that's a really, really amazing tool to have, because then you can kind of give people a heads up that this question has been asked, to look out for it, and to also be prepared to manage it. I think that the search experience of patients and investigators during a trial can matter because of the fact that, especially if it's an emerging therapy and there's not any patient responsive content published online, then we are creating a vacuum where misinformation basically can fill that void. And so the search experience matters in terms of making sure that we understand the real world questions that have been asked into search engines around a particular topic throughout the trial, to make sure that the queries are redirected back to appropriate sources to answer those questions. And it could be as simple as knowing what questions are typically asked and getting a med legal regulatory approved response, and programming a chatbot that can sit alongside that search engine result page and engage that patient and deliver that appropriate evidence-based response, based on verifying as well that there may be a healthcare professional or they are a patient who's already involved in the trial that you are allowed to speak to. So we can address that information void by redirecting those queries back. I think it is important to know that there are solutions to these problems. It's not like, oh no, now we've opened a whole can of worms and there's nothing we can do. There really is a number of different things that we can do. But I think what we need to do is start listening to the real world questions in real time around that particular topic throughout the trial. And, you know, I was interested to know, and you can contact me personally if you want to have a bigger discussion around this, because I would be really interested to hear from people who work day to day in the clinical trial space. Do you feel that information found online by stakeholders during a trial, and those stakeholders could be healthcare professionals who will be ultimately relied upon to prescribe that therapy, it could be patients, it could be carers who are anticipating a new therapy that they're hoping will be the answer to their loved one's health needs. What happens if they find misinformation and they start to discuss that in patient groups? Could that potentially establish assumptions or prejudices against a therapy that could threaten the ultimate acceptance of the real clinical trial outcomes? I think it's a really important consideration. And if so, can we intercept with those searches and redirect them to evidence-based content, or manage them in a different way through intercepting that search queries? And also considering other ways that we can thwart the discovery of misinformation by stakeholders. Perhaps if we see a question start to be commonly asked into search engines, we can proactively disseminate that information to the stakeholder groups that are engaged in the trial, so that they're not encouraged to turn to search engines where anyone could be answering that. It could be a vlogger, a blogger, a news outlet. You know, we just don't want to leave things to chance. And I think that we have a really good opportunity through adapting search listening as a tool throughout the trial process to make sure that we do manage the online narrative, which influences offline behavior more proactively. So thank you so much for your time watching this presentation. Please feel free to get in contact with me. Definitely love to hear from people in the clinical trial space as to whether or not search listening as a tool is something that you feel could be applied to help to address some of these challenges and issues from trial recruitment, particularly looking for those very rare patients, through to making sure that we're giving people the information that they really want, as well as managing the online narrative so that it doesn't influence and negatively impact the smooth launching of a new therapy. Thanks so much for your time.